We said earlier that there are several ways, even today, of defining, of understanding, of looking at mental disorder. I want to talk about some of them now. The first one will be the one that's most familiar to most people. It's called the medical model or the biological model. And it's called the biological model because the assumption is that all mental disorder is rooted in biology, in brain chemistry, in brain function, in brain physiology. Physiology is the way that the brain works. It's different from anatomy, which is how it's structured. The assumption here is that since mental disorders are effectively biological and usually chemical, then biological or chemical cures are what's needed to put them right. That's why we give people medications, which of course are chemicals. It's to change body chemistry, to change brain chemistry, and to help people to feel better. But that's not the only way of looking at mental disorder. We also have a thing called the social model. And if you're familiar with working with social workers, you will understand that their approach to mental disorder is much more about culture and society. For them, mental disorder is created by the society in which a person lives. So, for example, if you have a disability and there are no provisions made by society to help you to get over that disability, or at least to manage the problems associated with it, then there's a reasonable chance that you won't be able to do all of the things that other people in your society do. And if that's the case, then it's likely that you're going to become isolated, and if you become isolated, then you're likely to have very little to occupy yourself other than four walls and daytime TV, and in that situation, any of us would become depressed. So the social model is interested in how a person's social circumstances create mental disorder. And then we have the psychological model. It's not what happens to you that makes you ill, it's how you think about what happens to you. We've all heard about the glass half full, glass half empty dichotomy, that there are people who are optimists and there are people who are pessimists. Most of us who work in mental health wouldn't go for either of those options, to be honest. Optimists get disappointed a lot, pessimists are never happy. Realistic thinking seems to be the way to go. And the more realistic you're thinking, the more philosophical you can be in your approach to life, and therefore the less distressed you become when things don't turn out just as you would like them to be. It's the opposite of people who think that they're special or the world owes them favours. The reality, of course, is that the world won't see anyone as special, and it certainly won't owe you favours. If you go through your life expecting that everyone else will make things right for you, you'll have a very long wait and you're likely to become quite upset and distressed at the result. So there are three rather different models of mental health and mental disorder. The biological model or medical model, the social model, and the psychological model. How on earth do we make sense of these? Welcome to the stress and vulnerability model of mental health and disorder. The idea is basically very simple. Everyone has a limit to the amount of stress that they can deal with. We all have different limits, which is why some people take quite severe stresses in their stride, whereas others seem to become anxious, depressed, even psychotic at just the everyday background stress that most of us hardly even notice. That's because their level of stress tolerance, their vulnerability to stress, is different. And there's a really good illustration of this that comes from the First World War. There were people who had the very familiar typical symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. So they were hypervigilant, they were always looking around for danger. There were people who got depressed because of the situation they were in. There were people who were just downright terrified all the time. People didn't sleep, people didn't eat, and some of them became genuinely psychotic with hallucinations and delusions and thought disorders. There is another element to shell shock, which is an odd neurological condition where people were unable to control their limbs. Their bodies seem to move on their own without them even knowing about it. That's not something we're going to cover in this course, but it again illustrates what stress can do to ostensibly mentally healthy people. Many of them became overtly psychotic. Many of them ran because they couldn't handle the pressure, and to its shame the British military used to shoot them dead for doing so. So you see that there are differences in vulnerability, and that for each of us, if the stress that we face overcomes our level of vulnerability, or of robustness, shall I say, then we start to develop problems. There are 5 types of stressor that we focus on in mental health care. And these are biological, and that can be anything from exhaustion to sleep deprivation, even alcoholism or other addictions, or intoxication with substances. It can be illness. People get delirious when they're feverish. Any physical problem, any biological problem is a stressor. Then there's psychological. Remember the psychological model? It's not what we experience that causes the problem. It's how we perceive. It's what we think about what we experience that causes the problem. And then there is the social stressor. Again, we explained that with the social model. Your immediate surroundings can have a terrible impact upon your mental health. Imagine the difference between living in a quaint country cottage next to the vicarage, or on the 12th floor of an inner city skyscraper when the lifts are out and you're a single parent with 2 small children. We have the developmental model, which is stuff like coming of age, or that transition from school to work, or from university, the transition from work to retirement and becoming suddenly unoccupied and poorer very often as well, from going from single to married. All of these life stages and life changes can have profound effects. Bereavement, for example, can have a profound impact. And then there is cultural. Now that's rather like social. In fact, people often talk about socio-cultural, but there's more to it than just the social. The cultural stuff is the big stuff. Your immediate family and circle of friends, for example, might be fully aware of what it means to be psychotic, as we talked about earlier. But that doesn't stop all of the people in your town reading the headline on the Daily Mail and thinking that that makes you an axe-wielding murderer. I know it's a phrase I use a lot, but it just seems to roll off the tongue. So we have 5 different types of stress. And if we can help people to become less vulnerable to any or all of those 5 types of stressor, then we make them less vulnerable to mental disorder. And that's one of the tasks that we have. We make people less vulnerable by teaching them coping skills. The other thing that we do, certainly in the early stages of treatment, when people are more dependent on us than they are upon themselves, we work to reduce the amount of stresses that they face, because that will give them breathing space. And in that breathing space, we can teach them coping skills to make them more robust. And that, in a nutshell, is the stress and vulnerability model of mental health and disorder. Good, isn't it? So to recap, people get stressed, and therefore, when the stress reaches enough of a limit, of a threshold, which is different for everyone, they can become mentally disordered. Usually beginning with anxiety, then depression, we'll talk about why that is later, and then psychosis. People are susceptible to 5 types of stressor, which is biological, psychological, social, developmental, and cultural. And if we can help people by removing some of those stresses and then using that breathing space, that little oasis of calm that we've created, to help them to become more robust and therefore less vulnerable, then in little tiny steps we can reduce their vulnerability, increase their coping, and get them over whatever the problem is that they've been facing. And that's another thing I want you to keep in mind. Recovery doesn't happen overnight. Recovery is a series of tiny, tiny steps in the right direction. And it's always possible to take the next tiny step.